The sun dipped low behind the horizon, bleeding the sky into shades of amber and fire while the wind carried dust across the wide and lonely plains. A cowboy stood at the edge of the town of Willow Creek, his hat brim tilted low against the dying light. His name was Jonathan Hale, a man whose silence carried the weight of past winters and whose eyes told stories of nights alone on the prairie. He had been waiting for a letter that promised a new beginning, waiting for a woman who had agreed through ink and paper to share a life carved out of hardship and hope. The stagecoach's wheels groaned as it rolled into the settlement, its wood rattling like bones in a coffin. Children ran beside it, their laughter mixing with the call of merchants shutting up their shops for the night. Jonathan's chest tightened, each turn of those wheels bringing closer the woman who was to be his wife. He had rehearsed this moment countless times. How he would tip his hat, how he would extend his hand, how he would steady his voice so she might trust him. He had been waiting for Mary Collins, the woman who had answered his ad for a mail-order bride. But when the wagon door swung open, Jonathan's world tilted. Not one figure stepped down, but two women, their faces so alike that the air seemed to still around them, identical twins, both with chestnut hair braided in the same fashion, both with gray eyes that mirrored each other like ripples on a pond. The crowd gasped. The driver muttered under his breath that he hadn't asked questions when the two boarded in St. Louis. Jonathan's throat dried. He removed his hat, holding it tight against his chest. "Which one of you is Mary Collins?" he asked, his voice steady but his heart pounding like a stallion against its reins. The first twin stepped forward, her chin lifted, her gaze bold. "I am," she declared, though her sister's lips curled with the faintest smile, as though daring fate to unravel itself in its own good time. The townsfolk whispered, suspicion and curiosity hanging in the air. The Reverend shifted uneasily. The sheriff leaned against the hitching post, chewing tobacco with a grin that said trouble had just arrived. Jonathan knew at once this was no ordinary mistake. It was a storm waiting to break. The promise and the shadow. Jonathan had written his letters carefully, revealing just enough of his heart to make Mary believe in his sincerity. He had spoken of the ranch, the wide acres of grassland that stretched beyond sight, the cattle that needed tending, the winters that could freeze a man's bones if he faced them alone. He had spoken, too, of loneliness, of needing someone who might share a fire on cold nights and a prayer on weary mornings. But he had not spoken of grief, not of the brother he had buried after a range war with neighboring ranchers, not of the scar that cut across his ribs, a reminder of violence that had nearly ended him. And now, facing two women, one bold, one mysterious, he felt that silence might come back to haunt him. "You didn't say anything about his sister," Jonathan said, his voice low. The second twin laughed softly, her eyes glinting in the lantern light. "And she didn't say anything about you," she replied. "But here we are." The bold one, Mary, if she was truly Mary, laid a hand on his arm. "Jonathan Hale, we came because life gave us little choice. You asked for a bride. Perhaps fate has given you two to choose from." The words sent a murmur through the crowd. It was not just an arrival now, it was a scandal. The weight of the frontier that night. The twins stayed in the boarding house owned by Mrs. Tremblay, a widow who had seen every kind of trouble pass through Willow Creek. Jonathan could not sleep. Outside his cabin, the coyotes howled and the wind rattled the shutters like restless fingers. He paced the wooden floor, wondering if God was testing him or if fate had simply decided to mock him. The land was unforgiving, and life out west was already a gamble. Men froze to death in snowstorms, crops failed under scorching suns, and bullets found their mark quicker than prayers. He had not expected love to become just as dangerous, just as uncertain. By dawn, Jonathan saddled his horse and rode into town, dust rising behind him. He needed answers. Whispers and warnings at the saloon. Whispers had already turned into wagers. Men tossed coins, betting which twin the cowboy would choose. Women shook their heads, muttering about deception and sin. The sheriff, a man named Curtis Grant, stopped Jonathan at the door. "Hale," the sheriff said, spitting tobacco juice onto the dirt. "A man who can't tell his bride from her sister is in for more trouble than cattle rustlers." Jonathan brushed past him, but the words clung to him like burrs. Inside, the piano played a tune no one listened to. Jonathan ordered coffee, ignoring the liquor. He needed a clear head. He replayed the moment at the wagon again and again. Two faces, two smiles, two sets of gray eyes. Which one held truth? Which one held secrets? The storm rising by evening, the twins came to him. Mary introduced her sister as Margaret. Their story was tangled. A dead father, a ruined farm back east, debts that left them with nothing. Mary had answered the advertisement, but Margaret had insisted on accompanying her, unwilling to be left behind. Jonathan studied them both. Mary's words were steady, practical, filled with the tone of a woman who understood hardship. Margaret, however, spoke with fire, teasing him, questioning him as though daring him to prove his worth. It was not just a question of marriage anymore. It was a question of survival, of justice, of truth. For out on the horizon, riders had been seen, men who bore no mercy, men who carried grudges like loaded rifles. And in Willow Creek, where gossip traveled faster than a stagecoach, Jonathan Hale was about to find himself at the center of a story the whole frontier would not soon forget. The next morning came with a cold wind sweeping across the plains, carrying the smell of dust and sage. Jonathan Hale stood on the porch of his cabin, watching the sun climb slow and red above the horizon. He had not slept much. His thoughts tangled themselves into knots he could not untie. 2 women slept in the boarding house less than a mile away, and both claimed a part of his future whether he wanted them to or not. Mary, steady and practical, spoke with the voice of someone who knew the world could break a person if they let it. Margaret, bold and restless, carried herself with the daring of a gambler who never minded the stakes. Jonathan knew the prairie well enough to understand that storms were always brewing, whether in the sky or in the heart. His ranch stretched out behind him, acres of dry grass and stubborn cattle. The land needed care. Fences needed mending, and winter would not wait. But for the first time, Jonathan found himself unable to think of chores. He thought only of the 2 women who had stepped off the stagecoach like twin spirits sent to test his resolve. Tension in town, at the general store. Whispers grew heavier. Women bought flour and sugar while glancing at the boarding house windows. Men leaned on the hitching posts, chuckling about a cowboy too quiet for his own good who now had the whole town watching his every move. Mrs. Tremblay, the boarding house keeper, pulled Jonathan aside when he came to see the twins. Her face was lined with years of hardship, but her eyes were sharp. "You're a good man, Hale," she said. "But good men get themselves ruined when they don't see trouble coming. You've got to make a choice, and soon. A town like this eats gossip faster than a coyote eats scraps." Jonathan nodded, though his chest ached with uncertainty. Inside, Mary greeted him with calm composure, pouring tea as though they were already a husband and wife discussing the day's work. Margaret, however, leaned against the window frame, her smile crooked, her gaze steady. "So, Cowboy," she said, "have you decided which one of us you're keeping?" The words cut sharp, though she spoke them with mischief. Mary frowned but said nothing. Jonathan set his hat on the table, his jaw tight. "This isn't a game," he said. Margaret tilted her head, her braid falling over her shoulder. "Out here, everything is a game. Survival, love, trust, it's all a gamble. Don't you know that?" Mary's voice broke in, low and firm. "Stop it, Margaret. This isn't fair." Jonathan felt the air between them crackle. 2 women bound by blood but divided by spirit. And he was the man caught in the middle. Whispers of danger. That night, the town's blacksmith rode hard into Willow Creek, his horse lathered with sweat. He burst into the saloon, his voice trembling as he spoke of riders he had seen out on the prairie. 5 men, maybe 6, moving slow but steady. He swore he recognized their brands. Men tied to the Caldwell gang. A group of outlaws who had burned homesteads 2 counties east and left bodies in the dust. The sheriff laughed it off at first, but unease spread through the room. The Caldwell gang had a reputation: cattle thieves, bank robbers, killers without remorse. If they were moving west, Willow Creek might be next. Jonathan heard the news as he left the boarding house. Mary's face paled when he told her. Margaret's eyes, though, lit with a strange fire, as though danger stirred something inside her that ordinary life never could. "If they come," she whispered, "you'll fight them, won't you?" Jonathan's gaze hardened. "If they come, I'll do what I must." Mary touched his arm, steady and soft. "You shouldn't have to stand alone." The warmth of her hand lingered, but so did Margaret's smile, daring him to prove his courage. The burden of choice. As days passed, Jonathan tried to focus on ranch work, but the twins unsettled his every step. Mary helped Mrs. Tremblay with chores, proving herself useful and steady, the kind of partner who would weather blizzards and drought without complaint. Margaret, however, wandered the town, charming the young men at the saloon, laughing loud enough for everyone to hear. Jonathan found her one evening near the riverbank, skipping stones across the water. "You think I'm reckless," she said without turning to him. but I see the way you look at me. You're afraid of what I might make you feel." He clenched his fists. "You don't know what you're talking about." She faced him then, her gray eyes flashing in the fading light. "Don't I? A man can want more than safety. Jonathan Hale. Sometimes he wants fire. Sometimes he needs it." Her words struck deep, unsettling him. Mary's steadiness offered peace, but Margaret's fire threatened to consume him. And above them, the sky darkened with storm clouds, as though nature itself knew that danger was on its way. The approaching shadow. 2 nights later, riders appeared on the ridge, their silhouettes cut against the moonlight. 6 figures on horseback watching the town from a distance. No shots were fired. No words were shouted, but their presence was a warning. The sheriff gathered a few men to patrol, but fear whispered through Willow Creek like wind through dry grass. The Caldwell gang was near, and everyone knew it. Jonathan cleaned his rifle that night, his hand steady though his heart was not. He thought of Mary's quiet strength, Margaret's reckless smile, and the choice he had not yet made. The twins sat in the boarding house parlor, candles flickering around them. Mary prayed softly, her hands folded. Margaret stared into the flames, her lips curved in something between fear and excitement. Jonathan stepped inside, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "They're coming," he said. "And when they do, this town won't be the same." Mary's lips trembled, but she nodded. Margaret met his eyes without flinching. The cowboy had waited for a bride, but now he faced something darker than loneliness. He faced the fire of love and the threat of blood. The dawn broke quiet, but quiet never lasted long on the frontier. Jonathan Hale saddled his horse as the air still held the chill of night, his rifle slung across his back. The ridge beyond town lay empty, the outlaws having vanished with the morning mist, but unease lingered in Willow Creek like smoke after a fire. The Caldwell gang had shown themselves, and men like that never rode idle. The first shot cracked before noon, echoing down the main street like thunder splitting the earth. A bullet splintered the sign of the general store, sending townsfolk scattering for cover. Jonathan spun, rifle in hand, scanning the rooftops. The Caldwell gang had ridden closer, testing the town's fear, their laughter carrying on the wind. Mary and Margaret were at the boarding house when it happened. Mary pulled children inside, shielding them with her own body, while Margaret leaned against the doorframe, eyes burning bright as though danger thrilled her. Jonathan ran to them, breath hard in his chest. "Get inside," he commanded. Mary obeyed, though her face was pale. Margaret lingered, her lips curling in defiance. "And what about you, cowboy? Are you going to fight them all yourself?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "If I must," she smiled as though daring him. Mary, watching from the shadows of the room, felt her heart twist with worry, not just for his safety, but for the pull she saw between her sister and the man who was supposed to be hers. Blood and dust by evening. The Caldwell gang rode straight into town. 6 riders, their coats stained with dust, their guns resting easy on their hips. Their leader, Jared Caldwell, was a tall man with eyes like cold steel and a scar across his cheek that marked him as one who never forgave. He dismounted slow, his boots striking the dirt with the weight of a man who owned the ground he walked on. The sheriff stood firm, but Jonathan saw the tremor in his hands. "We ain't here to stay," Jared said, his voice low and dangerous. "We're just here to remind Willow Creek what happens to those who stand against us." "You got cattle, you got crops, you got gold. We'll be taking our share?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jonathan stepped forward, his rifle in hand but pointed low. "You won't be taking anything," he said, his voice steady, though his blood pounded in his ears. Jared's smile widened. "And who's gonna stop us? You, cowboy." The gang laughed, their laughter sharp as blades. Jonathan didn't flinch. "If I must." The town fell silent. Mary's hand clutched the doorway, her lips moving in prayer. Margaret's eyes shone with something else. A hunger for fire, for the storm that was about to break. A town divided, the days that followed were heavy with tension. The Caldwells camped outside town, close enough for everyone to feel their presence, far enough that no law could touch them until they struck. Men muttered about forming a posse. Others argued that fighting would only bring slaughter. Inside the boarding house, the sisters grew restless. Mary spent her days helping women sew bandages, preparing for wounds that might come. Margaret wandered the saloon, listening to men whisper plans and doubts, her smile stirring both trouble and desire. Jonathan tried to avoid them both, focusing on the ranch. But one evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, he found Mary waiting at his cabin door. "Jonathan," she said softly, her voice trembling, You can't stand against them alone. The town needs to come together. And you need someone beside you. I want to be that person. Not just because of letters we wrote, but because I believe in you." Her eyes shone with truth, with quiet strength. Jonathan felt his chest tighten, a warmth stirring deep inside him. But later that night, Margaret found him at the riverbank. "She gives you peace," Margaret whispered, stepping close enough that he felt her breath. "But peace won't keep you alive. You need fire, Jonathan. You need someone who will stand with you and never flinch when blood is spilled. I am not afraid of them. And I am not afraid of you." Her hand brushed his, her touch like a spark. Jonathan pulled away, but the fire she lit inside him refused to die. The test of courage in the third night. The Caldwells struck. Shots shattered the silence. Flames licked at the edge of town where a barn burned bright against the darkness. Cattle scattered, their cries echoing through the chaos. Jonathan rode hard toward the fire, his rifle ready. The sheriff and a handful of men joined him. Their courage wavering, but their need to defend their homes stronger. Bullets whined past his ears. Men shouted, women screamed. Mary was there too, dragging children from the burning barn. Her skirts singed, her face streaked with soot. Jonathan caught sight of her and felt fear claw at him. Fear of losing her before he could decide his heart. And Margaret. Margaret was at his side, a pistol in her hand, her eyes wild with fury. She fired at the outlaws without hesitation, her laughter ringing as though she had been born for the fight. The night turned into a storm of fire and gunpowder, and Jonathan knew this was only the beginning. The dangerous heart. When the smoke cleared, 2 townsmen were dead, 3 wounded. The Caldwells had taken cattle and supplies, but they had not broken Willow Creek. Jonathan stood in the ashes, his rifle heavy in his hands, his body trembling with exhaustion. Mary wept softly as she bandaged the wounded, her prayers carrying hope through the broken night. Margaret wiped blood from her hands, her eyes burning with pride as though she had proven herself in the flames. Jonathan's heart ached. 2 women stood before him, one who gave him peace, one who gave him fire. And in the distance, the Caldwell gang rode away, leaving behind a promise that they would return. The cowboy had waited for a bride, but now he stood in the middle of a war, of guns, of hearts, of fate itself. The ashes of fear. The barn still smoldered 3 days after the attack. The air heavy with the scent of burned hay and charred wood. Townsfolk walked past the ruins with eyes cast down, speaking in whispers as though their voices might call the Caldwells back. Willow Creek had survived the fire, but survival came with scars. 2 graves had been dug on the hill, and every man knew there might be more before winter was through. Jonathan Hale rode the perimeter of his ranch each dawn, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the horizon. He saw nothing but wide prairie and restless cattle. Yet he felt danger pressing in, invisible but certain. The Caldwells were waiting, and waiting was its own kind of torture. Mary visited him often during those days, bringing bread and tending to the small injuries he ignored. She spoke softly, urging him to lean not only on his rifle but on the strength of others. "You're not alone, Jonathan," she said, her eyes steady as she pressed her hand against his arm. "You don't have to carry the burden all by yourself." Her words soothed him, yet her twin's presence stirred the dust just as much as the outlaws. Margaret spent her nights at the saloon, her laughter carrying louder than the piano, her eyes watching Jonathan with a fire that refused to dim. The sisters divided. The boarding house had grown tense, its walls holding the friction of 2 hearts pulling in opposite directions. Mary kept to her prayers, sewing quilts for the wounded and preparing food for the families who had lost their barn. She clung to duty as though it were her lifeline. Margaret, by contrast, lived as though danger were a lover. She cleaned her pistol at the dinner table, spoke of riding out to face the Caldwells head-on, and mocked the sheriff for trembling hands. "You scare them," Mary whispered one night when only the 2 of them sat by the candlelight. "Better to scare them than to cower," Margaret answered. "But you bring shame to us. Jonathan looks at you as though—" Margaret's smile cut her short. "As though what? As though he can't decide? Perhaps he doesn't need to. Perhaps he wants both peace and fire, and perhaps I am the one bold enough to give it to him." Mary's face flushed, her hands gripping the quilt in her lap. "You would betray me?" "I would save him," Margaret said simply. "And if you cannot see that, then perhaps you are the one who would betray him, with your weakness." The candle guttered, and silence fell heavy between them, a silence that would not mend easily. The noose tightens, By the end of the week, the Caldwells returned, 6 riders again. Though this time they rode straight down the main street at midday, their horses kicking up dust as women pulled children out of the way. Jared Caldwell dismounted in front of the saloon, his scarred face lit with a cruel smile. "Time's running short," he called. "You've had your warning. Next time we come, we take everything." The sheriff tried to stand tall, but his voice wavered when he declared that Willow Creek would not bow. The gang only laughed. They shot out the saloon sign for sport, then rode back to their camp beyond the ridge, leaving fear in their wake. Jonathan followed their trail at a distance, his heart pounding as he watched them vanish into the horizon. They were preparing for something bigger, he could feel it, something that would test every man and woman in Willow Creek. That night, he spoke at the town meeting. The church was full, lanterns casting long shadows on the wooden walls. "We can't wait for them to strike again," Jonathan said. "We need defenses, we need rifles, and we need courage. If we give them an inch, they'll take the town." Men nodded grimly. Women clutched their children closer. Mary sat near the front, her gaze never leaving him, her heart swelling with both fear and admiration. Margaret leaned against the back wall, her eyes burning with pride at every defiant word he spoke. The town was with him, but the question lingered. Would it be enough? Love and fire later. As the meeting dispersed, Mary approached him beneath the church steeple. "Jonathan," she whispered, "I meant every word I said before. I want to stand by you, not just as your promised bride, but as the woman who will share your burdens. Let me be that for you." Her hand trembled as it touched his, her eyes pleading. Before he could answer, Margaret stepped from the shadows. "And what of me?" she said, her voice sharp. "I've already stood by him in the fight. I've already proven myself. You sew quilts and whisper prayers, but when bullets fly, it's me he needs." Mary's face hardened, her strength rising. "He needs a heart, Margaret. Not fire that burns everything it touches." "And what if he wants both?" Margaret shot back, her gray eyes blazing. Jonathan's breath caught. He felt torn apart. His heart pulled between 2 women, each fierce in her own way, each offering something the other could not. The bell above them tolled, echoing across the dark prairie like a warning. The siege begins the next morning. Willow Creek woke to find riders on every ridge. The Caldwells had come in force. More than 6 now, at least a dozen, their campfires glowing in the distance like stars fallen to the earth. The town was surrounded. Men sharpened knives and loaded rifles. Women gathered children into the church, their prayers louder than ever before. The sheriff paced, sweat beading on his brow. Jonathan stood tall, his rifle in hand, his jaw set. Mary stood beside him, her face pale but her spirit steady. Margaret stood on his other side, her pistol gleaming, her smile fierce. The cowboy had waited for a bride, but now he faced something greater. A siege that would decide not only the fate of Willow Creek, but which love would carry him through the fire. Dawn came with gunfire. The Caldwells struck fast, their rifles cracking from the ridge as bullets tore through the quiet streets. Windows shattered, horses screamed, and the town woke in terror. Jonathan Hale was already at his post, rifle in hand, his heart pounding steady against the storm. He shouted orders, pulling men to cover behind barrels and fences, the sheriff stumbling beside him. Townsfolk who had never fired a shot now gripped weapons with trembling hands, driven not by skill but by desperation. Mary was in the church, kneeling with children huddled close, her prayers spilling out between sobs. Yet when wounded men were carried in, she rose to meet them, her hands steady as she tore strips of cloth for bandages. Her voice calm, though her heart quaked. Margaret, by contrast, ran into the smoke, pistol flashing, braid whipping behind her. She fought with the reckless abandon of someone who had nothing left to lose. She stood beside Jonathan as shots rang around them, her laughter sharp as she emptied her revolver into the shadows of the outlaws. "You see, Jonathan?" she cried, reloading with swift hands. "This is what it means to live. This is what it means to fight." Jonathan's jaw clenched, torn between admiration and fear. Her courage was fire, but fire burned too easily. Blood in the dust, the Caldwells pulled back after the first assault, leaving 2 townsmen dead and another bleeding out in Mary's arms. The church filled with groans and prayers, and still the outlaws lingered, circling the town like wolves around a wounded deer. At the riverbank, Jonathan and the sheriff argued about strategy. "We can't hold forever," the sheriff muttered, sweat on his brow. "They'll come again, stronger." "Then we hold as long as we can," Jonathan answered, his voice iron. "Because if we give them this town, they'll take everything, and they'll never stop." As he spoke, Mary approached, her apron stained with blood. "Jonathan," she whispered, "men are dying. Children are crying for their fathers. You mustn't carry this alone. Let the town see your strength, but let them also see your heart." Her words cut deep, offering not fire but something quieter, something enduring. Jonathan wanted to believe her. But then Margaret stepped from the shadows, pistol at her hip, eyes flashing. "She would have you bow," Margaret said, her voice sharp. "But I would have you rise. Don't waste yourself on weakness, Jonathan. Stand, fight, and let them know your name." The two sisters stared at each other, the air between them heavy with more than blood and smoke. It was love, jealousy, and something darker, something that threatened to tear them apart. The second wave, the outlaws, came again at dusk. This time they rode hard, hooves thundering, rifles blazing. Flames roared as another barn caught fire, smoke choking the streets. Jonathan fired until his shoulder ached, his voice hoarse from shouting. Margaret fought beside him, wild and unyielding, her pistol a blur in her hands. When Jonathan stumbled, she grabbed his arm, steadying him with a grin. "You see? You need me." But across the square, Mary ran into the chaos, pulling a wounded boy from the path of charging horses, her skirts torn, her face streaked with ash. Jonathan's breath caught as he saw her courage. Not loud, not wild, but steadfast. The kind that endured storms instead of feeding them. The battle raged until night fell. The Caldwells retreated once more, but Willow Creek bled for its defiance. The townsfolk gathered in the church, faces hollow, eyes haunted. A choice in the fire later that night. Jonathan walked through the smoke-filled streets, his body heavy with exhaustion, his mind torn apart. Mary waited at the church steps, her hands clasped, her eyes filled with sorrow. Margaret leaned against the saloon wall, her pistol still warm, her lips curved in that reckless smile. Mary stepped forward first. "Jonathan, you saw today we can endure if we stand together. I will fight beside you, but with hope, not recklessness. Let me be your strength." Margaret's voice cut through the night. "And you saw me too. I don't pray while others bleed, I take up arms. I give you fire, Jonathan Hale, and fire is what you'll need to end this war." Jonathan's chest tightened. Peace or fire, calm or storm. Two sisters, two paths, both bound to him by fate's cruel hand. The reckoning before dawn, scouts reported the Caldwells massing for one final assault. More riders had joined them. This would not be a raid, it would be a reckoning. Willow Creek would either stand or fall. Jonathan gripped his rifle, his face carved with resolve. Mary kissed his hand, her tears silent but her faith unshaken. Margaret pressed her palm to his chest, her eyes daring him to choose fire over fear. The cowboy had waited for a bride, but now he faced the fiercest dawn of his life. A battle where bullets and love would both demand blood. The final dawn, the sun rose red, heavy with dust as though the heavens themselves knew blood would spill before the day was done. Jonathan Hale stood in the center of Willow Creek, rifle in hand, the church bell tolling behind him. The townsfolk gathered with him, their faces pale, their courage trembling like a candle flame in the wind. On the ridge, the Caldwells appeared, not 6 this time, but 15 riders strong, their silhouettes black against the morning light. Jared Caldwell rode at their head, his scar catching the sun, his grin cruel as ever. "Today we finish this," Jonathan whispered, though whether to himself or to the sisters standing nearby, he could not say. Mary clasped his hand, her touch gentle, her voice steady. "Whatever happens, you are not alone. God stands with you." Margaret pressed close on his other side, pistol gleaming, her eyes burning. "And so do I. But unlike God, I'll spill blood for you." Jonathan's chest ached with the weight of their faith, their fire, their love. The charge, the outlaws thundered down the ridge, rifles cracking, hooves pounding like the drums of war. The townsfolk fired from behind barrels, fences, and the church steps, bullets screaming through the dust, the air filled with smoke and shouts, the smell of gunpowder sharp as lightning. Jonathan led the defense, his rifle steady, his voice cutting through the chaos. Mary ran among the wounded, dragging men to safety, her skirts soaked with blood but her eyes unyielding. Margaret fought beside Jonathan, wild and fearless, every shot a challenge to death itself. The Caldwells broke through the first line, and the square became a storm of fists and gunfire. Jonathan swung his rifle like a club, felling one man, then fired point blank into another. He felt fire graze his shoulder, blood searing hot. But he did not fall. Sacrifice in the heart of the chaos. Jared Caldwell rode straight for him, Pistol raised. Jonathan lifted his rifle, but the world slowed. He knew he would not be fast enough. Mary screamed his name, racing toward him. Margaret moved too, her pistol flashing. One sister prayed, the other fired. The bullet struck true, but it did not find Jonathan. Margaret stood before him, her body taking the blow. Her pistol clattered to the ground as she fell into his arms, her breath ragged, her eyes blazing even as life slipped away. "Told you," she gasped, blood staining her lips. "I'd stand with you in the fire." Jonathan's heart shattered. "Margaret," she smiled faintly, her fingers curling against his chest. "Live for both of us." And then her hand fell still. The fall of Caldwell rage consumed Jonathan. He rose, his rifle steady, his voice a roar. The townsfolk rallied, their fear turning to fury. Together they drove the Caldwells back, bullets tearing through dust and smoke until the outlaws broke. Jared Caldwell cursed, firing wildly, but Jonathan's shot found him clean. The outlaw fell from his saddle, his reign of terror ending in the dust of Willow Creek. The survivors fled, their horses